My grandmother left me her entire estate worth $2,400,000. The parents who cut me off at 16 showed up to the will reading, grinning. Of course, we'll manage it for you. But when the judge read the next page, their smiles shattered. I, 28 am, was 16 when my parents told me to leave. Not because I'd done anything particularly terrible, but because their new life didn't have room for the baggage of their past. My mother had remarried a wealthy surgeon after my father left us when I was 12, and my stepfather made it clear that supporting another man's child wasn't part of his vision for their future together. My mother agreed. She sat me down one evening and explained that it was time I learned to be independent, that I was old enough to make my own way. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes before she handed me $200 and wished me luck. My grandmother was the only one who answered when I called that night from a gas station payphone. She was my father's mother, a woman my mother had always dismissed as difficult and interfering. She picked me up without questions, drove me to her modest home across the state, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. She was 73 then, sharp as a tack, with hands weathered from decades of working in her garden and eyes that saw through every lie anyone tried to tell her. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were honest. My grandmother didn't coddle me. She expected me to work, to study, to earn my place in the world. I got a part-time job at a hardware store, finished high school, and applied for scholarships. She helped where she could, but she made sure I understood that survival required effort. My mother called twice in those first 6 months, brief conversations where she asked if I was managing and seemed relieved when I said yes. After that, the call stopped entirely. My stepfather's money had bought them a new house in a gated community, and I wasn't part of that picture. I went to college on a combination of scholarships and student loans, studying finance, because I'd learned the hard way that money mattered more than people wanted to admit. My grandmother came to my graduation, the only family member in the crowd. She hugged me afterward and told me she was proud, and I believed her because she'd never lied to me before. I got a job at an investment firm in the city, started paying off my loans, and visited her every other weekend. She was getting older, moving slower, but her mind stayed sharp. She'd invested wisely over the years, she told me once, enough to live comfortably and leave something behind when she was gone. I didn't think much about inheritance. That wasn't why I visited, wasn't why I called her every Tuesday evening to check in. She was the only person who'd chosen me when it mattered, and that was enough. But when she passed away at 85, peacefully in her sleep, I learned just how carefully she'd planned for what came next. The lawyer's office was downtown, a small practice in an old building with creaking floors and tall windows. I arrived 15 minutes early for the will reading, expecting it to be just me and maybe a few distant cousins I'd never met. Instead, I found my mother and stepfather already seated in the waiting room. She looked older, her hair colored a careful blonde and her clothes expensive in that understated way wealthy people preferred. My stepfather sat beside her, checking his phone with the air of someone who had better places to be. My mother stood when she saw me, her smile practiced and warm. She told me how sorry she was about my grandmother, how she'd always meant to visit more, but life had been so busy. I nodded and took a seat across from them, keeping my expression neutral. My stepfather glanced up long enough to offer a handshake that felt like a business transaction. They didn't ask how I was doing, didn't ask about my job or my life. The conversation stayed safely on the surface until the lawyer called us into his office. The office was lined with law books and smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The lawyer, a man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, gestured for us to sit. He expressed his condolences and explained that he'd been my grandmother's attorney for over 30 years. Then he opened the folder in front of him and began to read. My grandmother's estate was worth $2,400,000. The number hung in the air like a physical thing, and I felt my mother shift forward in her seat. My stepfather's phone disappeared into his pocket. The lawyer explained that the estate included her house, which had appreciated significantly in value, along with investment accounts and savings she'd accumulated through decades of careful planning. She'd never lived extravagantly, never mentioned the full extent of her wealth, and I realized with sudden clarity that she'd been protecting it, protecting me, from exactly this moment. My mother was already talking before the lawyer finished. She said how grateful she was that her former mother-in-law had been so generous, how important it was that I had family to help manage such a significant inheritance. My stepfather added that they had experience with investments and estate management, that they'd be happy to set up a trust to ensure the money was handled properly. They were smiling, both of them, with the confidence of people who'd already decided how this would unfold. The lawyer let them finish, his expression unchanged. Then he turned to the next page of the will and continued reading. My grandmother had been very specific in her instructions. The entire estate was to be transferred to me directly, with no trusts, no management requirements, no involvement from any other party. But there was more. She'd included a letter to be read aloud at the will reading, addressed to my mother. The lawyer's voice stayed level as he read her words. My grandmother wrote that she'd watched my mother abandon her own son for the promise of an easier life, watched her choose money over her child without a second thought. She wrote that she'd seen me struggle and work and build something from nothing, and that she wanted me to have the security she'd never been able to give my father before he died. She'd updated her will the month after I moved in with her, making sure that everything she'd built would go to the person who'd earned it through loyalty and love, not the person who'd walked away when it was convenient. The letter ended with a message for me, read aloud in that same measured tone. She told me to use the money wisely, to build the life I deserved, and to remember that family was defined by actions, not blood. She said she loved me, and that she hoped I'd known that every day I'd lived under her roof. The silence that followed felt absolute. My mother's face had gone pale, her smile erased completely. My stepfather looked between the lawyer and me, his expression calculating as he tried to find an angle that didn't exist. I sat there, my grandmother's words echoing in my head, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized was missing. My mother recovered first, her voice sharp as she demanded to know if the will could be contested. The lawyer explained calmly that my grandmother had been of sound mind when she drafted the document, that multiple doctors had evaluated her mental capacity in the months before her death specifically to prevent such challenges. Everything had been done legally, thoroughly, with the kind of careful planning my grandmother had applied to every aspect of her life. My stepfather tried a different approach. He suggested that families should support each other, that they could help me invest the money properly, that I was young and might make mistakes without guidance. I looked at him and asked where that family support had been when I was 16 and homeless. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither did my mother. They left shortly after, my mother pausing at the door to tell me I was being cruel, that I didn't understand how hard things had been for her back then. I told her she was right. I didn't understand how a mother could choose a man over her child, but I'd had 12 years to accept that she had. The door closed behind them, and I was alone with the lawyer. He spent the next hour walking me through the details of the estate, the accounts I now controlled, the house that was legally mine. He'd known my grandmother well, he told me, and she'd been adamant about making sure everything was airtight. She'd anticipated exactly what would happen when my mother learned about the inheritance, and she'd planned accordingly. It was, he said with something close to admiration, one of the most thorough estate plans he'd ever executed. I drove to my grandmother's house afterward, the keys heavy in my pocket. The garden was overgrown, the way it had been getting in her last months when maintaining it became too difficult. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it, neat and organized and smelling faintly of the lavender sachets she kept in every closet. I sat in her kitchen, in the chair I'd sat in countless evenings during high school, while she helped me with homework or listened to me talk about my day, and let myself cry for the first time since she'd died. Update 1. The weeks following the will reading were quieter than I'd expected. My mother tried calling twice, but I let the calls go to voicemail. Her messages started with attempts at guilt, talking about family and forgiveness, but shifted to barely veiled anger by the second one. She wanted to know what I planned to do with the money, whether I understood the responsibility of managing such wealth. I deleted both messages without responding. My stepfather sent an email through his lawyer, a formal letter suggesting mediation to discuss family matters. I forwarded it to my grandmother's attorney, who responded with equally formal language explaining that there was nothing to mediate. The estate was settled, the assets distributed according to the deceased's explicit wishes, and any further contact would be considered harassment. I didn't hear from either of them again after that. What surprised me was the number of relatives who suddenly remembered my existence. Cousins I barely knew reached out on social media. Old family friends sent messages expressing their condolences and hoping we could reconnect. Most of them mentioned my grandmother's generosity at some point in the conversation, casual references that made their intentions clear. I responded politely to a few before deciding that silence was easier. The people who'd mattered had been there when I had nothing. I took 2 weeks off work to handle the estate details and clear out my grandmother's house. Going through her things was harder than I'd anticipated. Every drawer, every closet held reminders of the life she'd built and the years she'd shared with me. I found old report cards she'd saved from my high school years, photographs of my college graduation, letters I'd sent her during my first year away at school. She'd kept everything, organizing it all in boxes labeled with my name. In her bedroom closet, behind a stack of sweaters, I found a smaller box that wasn't labeled. Inside were letters my father had written her before he died, along with photographs of him at various ages. There was also a leather journal, my grandmother's handwriting filling page after page with thoughts and observations from the years after my father's death. I sat on her bedroom floor and read the entire thing in one sitting. She wrote about her guilt over not protecting my father better, about watching him struggle with addiction and being unable to save him. She wrote about her determination not to fail again when I showed up on her doorstep, about the fear that she was too old to raise another child. But mostly she wrote about love, about choosing to show up every day and do the work of caring for someone even when it was difficult. She'd known my mother might eventually want a piece of whatever she left behind, and she'd planned the estate structure specifically to prevent that. The money was protection, she'd written, a way to make sure I never had to depend on anyone who'd already proven they couldn't be trusted. I finished clearing out the house at the end of the second week. Most of the furniture went to charity, but I kept a few pieces, her writing desk and the kitchen table and the chair she'd sat in every evening while we talked. I hired a real estate agent to list the property, a decision that felt both necessary and painful. The house sold within a month, a young family with 2 kids who promised to take care of her garden. I stood in the empty living room on the day of closing and thanked her out loud for everything she'd given me. The inheritance changed my life in practical ways. I paid off my student loans completely, eliminating a debt I'd expected to carry for another decade. I bought a small house in a neighborhood I actually wanted to live in, nothing extravagant, but mine in a way renting had never been. I increased my retirement contributions and set up investment accounts, using the financial knowledge I'd spent years learning. My grandmother had given me security, the kind that came from knowing I'd never have to scramble the way I had at 16. But the real change was deeper, harder to quantify. I'd spent 12 years building a life without my mother, learning to trust my own judgment and make my own way. The inheritance didn't give me that. It confirmed what my grandmother had already shown me through her actions. Worth wasn't determined by blood or obligation, but by who showed up when showing up was hard. She'd shown up for me, and the money was simply her final statement on the subject. Update 2. 6 months after the will reading, my mother showed up at my workplace. The receptionist called my extension and told me I had a visitor, and I knew before asking who it was. She was waiting in the lobby when I came down, dressed in the kind of casual, expensive clothes that wealthy people wore to look approachable. She smiled when she saw me and suggested we get coffee at the shop across the street. I almost said no, but curiosity won out. The need to know what had motivated her to try again after months of silence. We sat at a corner table, and she ordered some complicated drink while I stuck with black coffee. She started with small talk, asking about my job and my house, and whether I was seeing anyone. I answered with minimal details, waiting for her to get to the point. It took her 15 minutes. She told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking, that she regretted how things had happened when I was younger. She said she'd been in a difficult position, trying to build a new life after my father left, and she'd made choices she now wished she could change. The apology sounded rehearsed, delivered with just enough emotion to seem genuine without crossing into actual vulnerability. Then she got to what she actually wanted. My stepfather's medical practice had hit some financial difficulties, she explained. There'd been a lawsuit, settled but expensive, and their investments hadn't performed as well as expected. They weren't in trouble exactly, but things were tighter than they'd been. She wasn't asking for money, she emphasized, just wondering if I might consider helping with a short-term loan. Family helping family, the way it should have been all along. I let her finish, watching her expression shift between practiced remorse and barely concealed desperation. When she finally stopped talking, I asked her how much she needed. She named a figure, 200,000. the same amount she'd paid for her first year at the gated community house. A coincidence, I was sure. I told her no, not because I couldn't afford it, but because lending her money would require me to believe she'd changed, and nothing about this conversation suggested that was true. She hadn't come because she felt genuine remorse or wanted to rebuild a relationship. She'd come because she was in a position where she needed something from me, and she was willing to perform whatever version of motherhood might get her access to my grandmother's money. Her expression hardened immediately. The practiced warmth disappeared, replaced by anger that she didn't bother to hide. She told me I was being selfish, that family was supposed to support each other through hard times. I pointed out that she'd kicked me out at 16, which seemed like a pretty hard time that she hadn't felt obligated to help me through. She said that was different, that I'd been old enough to work, that she'd been starting over and couldn't handle the burden. I told her that was exactly my point. She'd made her choices when I needed her, and I was making mine now that she needed me. The inheritance was protection against ever being in that position again, and I wasn't interested in pretending we were family just because it was suddenly convenient for her. She could build her own security the way I'd had to build mine, through work and planning and actually showing up for the people who mattered. She left without finishing her coffee, her parting comment something about how my grandmother had turned me bitter and vengeful. I sat there alone for a while afterward, my coffee getting cold while I thought about her words. Maybe there was some truth to them. Maybe the inheritance had given me the power to refuse her in a way that felt satisfying, a reversal of the dynamic that had defined my teenage years. But if that was revenge, it was the kind my grandmother had engineered carefully, using money to make sure I never had to depend on people who'd already proven they couldn't be trusted. I went back to work and didn't think about my mother again for a long time. She sent one final email a few weeks later, a shorter message that accused me of being heartless and predicted I'd regret cutting her off when I was older. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said by her actions 12 years ago and mine now. Update 3. A year after the inheritance, I established a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name. I worked with a local foundation to create a program specifically for students who'd aged out of foster care or been cut off from family support. The fund would cover tuition, housing, and basic expenses, the kind of comprehensive support that made the difference between dropping out and finishing school. I seeded it with $300,000 from the estate, enough to support several students each year indefinitely. The foundation staff helped me design the selection criteria. I wanted students who'd demonstrated resilience and self-sufficiency, who'd worked their way through impossible situations and refused to give up. The kind of students my grandmother would have recognized immediately, would have invited into her home without hesitation. The first awards went out that fall, 5 students who sent thank you letters that I read multiple times, their words reminding me of the 16-year-old who'd called his grandmother from a gas station and asked for help. My career progressed steadily. I made senior analyst within 2 years, my understanding of financial systems sharpened by the experience of managing my own inheritance responsibly. I bought better furniture, took vacations I actually enjoyed, and dated occasionally, though nothing serious developed. The money hadn't made me happy exactly, but it had removed the constant underlying anxiety about survival that had shaped my early 20s. I could focus on building a life instead of just maintaining one. I heard through extended family that my mother and stepfather had sold their house and moved to something smaller. The medical practice had recovered somewhat, but never quite regained its previous success. They were comfortable by most standards, but not wealthy, not the way they'd been. I felt nothing when I learned this, no satisfaction or sympathy or anything else. They'd become people I used to know, relevant to my history, but not my present. The scholarship fund grew as I added to it each year, a portion of my salary designated for the cause my grandmother would have supported. I attended the annual award ceremony, shaking hands with students who reminded me why the money mattered. One recipient, a 19-year-old who'd been working 2 jobs while attending community college, told me the scholarship meant he could focus on his studies instead of just surviving. His words echoed conversations I'd had with my grandmother years ago, and I understood then what she'd been trying to teach me all along. Security wasn't just about having money. It was about using resources to create space for growth, for yourself and for others who needed the same chance you'd gotten. My grandmother had given me that space, first through her home and later through her careful planning. The inheritance was a tool, not an end, a way to build something that lasted beyond her lifetime. I still visit her grave every few months, usually on Sunday mornings when the cemetery is quiet. I tell her about the scholarship students, about the life I've built, about the choices I've made with the security she provided. I don't know if she can hear me, but the ritual matters regardless, a way of acknowledging that everything I have came from her decision to show up when no one else would. My mother tried to contact me one final time, 3 years after the will reading. She sent a letter to my office, handwritten this time instead of typed. She wrote that she'd been wrong about a lot of things, that she hoped someday I might be willing to talk. The letter felt more genuine than previous attempts, less calculated and more raw. But by then I'd realized that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. I could acknowledge her regret without welcoming her back into my life, could accept her apology without pretending the damage hadn't been done. I wrote a brief response explaining that I wished her well, but wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship. The years with my grandmother had taught me what family should look like, and nothing in my history with my mother suggested she could provide that. I sent the letter and filed hers away, another piece of a past I'd learned to carry without letting it define my present. The inheritance gave me power, the kind that came from security and options and the ability to choose who I let into my life. My grandmother had understood that when she structured her estate, had known that the money would protect me from ever having to depend on people who'd already failed me. It was revenge only in the sense that it reversed a power dynamic, giving me the strength to walk away from relationships that had never been healthy. But mostly it was love, expressed through careful planning and a determination to make sure I never faced 16 again without resources. I built a life on that foundation, solid and deliberate, and mine in every sense that mattered. And when I thought about my grandmother, it wasn't with grief over her absence, but gratitude for everything she'd given me, lessons and security, and the unwavering belief that I was worth showing up for. That was the inheritance that mattered most, more valuable than any dollar amount, though the money certainly helped make it real.